In the last video, we worked our way through the Vedas, and we talked about what the Vedas are in terms of being the earliest sacred teachings within Hinduism. And we talked about there being four big Vedic collections, and then we worked our way through the four sections that are found in each of the collections. We, of course, ended with the Upanishads, sitting near the teacher, where we talked about the idea that we now have some answers to those speculative questions about individual existence that were largely asked in the Aranyakas, the third section of the Vedas, meaning compositions of the forest. Remember, the earlier two sections of the Vedas tended to have more of a this-worldly focus, focused on finding happiness and health and prosperity in this life. It's in those later sections that we start to ask the questions and find the answers to the questions, such as, why am I here? Who am I? What is the purpose of existence? What is my relationship to the rest of reality? What happens when I die, etc. So that's what we start to find in the Upanishads, are some answers to those fundamental questions about individual existence. And the answers that we find there really create kind of the foundation for what Hindus to this day will still believe about some of those fundamental questions concerning their existence. And we really get an introduction here to some very foundational terms and concepts, several of which we're going to highlight in this particular video, and you can see them on the screen: karma, samsara, and moksha. Right? These are terms that are used very frequently in the Sanskrit, even by English-speaking scholars, and at least with karma, many of you have probably heard of that term before. It's already kind of entered into our vernacular, our everyday language, as English speakers, even English-speaking Americans, for example. So let's kind of work our way through each of these concepts and see how it starts to create a framework for understanding individual existence. So first, karma. Karma literally just means action, and usually we think more of karma in this context as a system of rewards and punishments attached to various actions. So it's not just the actions themselves, it's this system of rewards and punishments that is attached to those various actions. Now, of course, we're mostly thinking here about human actions, as we are human beings trying to discover the truth about reality and about our own existence. So the idea here is that most of our actions, perhaps all of our actions, carry with them some kind of consequence. And this consequence is determined by this system. Right? It's a very impersonal, in a sense, system. It's not necessarily a God, a divine being. It is a system. It's a kind of law, right? We might think of it as something sort of like the physical laws of the universe, gravity, things like that when we're talking about Earth. Karma is this system that kind of determines the consequences of our actions, which will then have impact on our lives through the consequences, the rewards and punishments that come as a result of our actions. So whenever you're thinking about karma, try to think of it as a system of rewards and punishments attached to various actions. So the idea within the Upanishads is that because all of our actions seem to produce this karma, we need to have the consequences work themselves out. And that's a common way of thinking about the system of karma. Karma has to work itself out, or it has to be exhausted by having those consequences come to fruition, right? So if I do something negative, if I perform a negative action, then I need to face a certain kind of punishment in order for that, what is sometimes called karmic residue, to be dealt with, to be exhausted from what we'll see eventually is our souls, right? So Hindus, of course, recognize that when you actually look at this and try to make sense of it in everyday life, it doesn't always seem to work out perfect if we think of this life as being a singular experience. We are born, we die, and that's it. After all, I think we could all maybe think of people, right? Maybe people we know, maybe people who are famous for whatever reason, who seem to do a lot of negative things. And yet we don't necessarily see a lot of negative consequences, any punishments coming to them as a result of their negative actions. Right? We also see a lot of really good people who do a lot of very positive things, and yet those people can sometimes never catch a break. The positive rewards for their good actions never seem to come to fruition. Their good karma never is exhausted in this life, right? Plus we have the difficulty surrounding birth, right? Why are some people born into a lap of luxury, or at least into a very comfortable environment, and others are born in the midst of disease and war and all kinds of other negative situations? What the composers of the Upanishads start to teach is that it's clear that karma is a system that actually works its way through not just one individual lifetime, but many lifetimes. That's why when we see somebody who doesn't seem to be rewarded for all of their good that is done in this lifetime, and then they die, there must be another lifetime where that good karma can be exhausted. After all, this karma is a system. It must be worked out. And this starts to lead into the second key concept that is developed in the Upanishads of samsara. Samsara we might think of as reincarnation. I think a better way to describe samsara is as the cycle of death and rebirth. A cycle of death and rebirth, right? The idea is that for karma to really make sense, right, it has to be part of a larger cycle of death and rebirth, so that when karmic residue clearly is not exhausted within a given lifetime, that soul must come back again in order to face the rewards or the punishments that are a consequence of their actions in the previous lifetime. That, of course, will explain why some people are born into certain situations and others are born into other situations, right? Western traditions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam don't always have really great answers to that kind of question, right? Why am I born in this kind of situation? Why is a child being born right now in the middle of violence and political uncertainty and turmoil and disease and starvation, etc.? The Western traditions don't have a great answer for why that happens, right? I suppose they could say that it is God's will, but that seems to open up a whole new set of questions. With Hinduism, you have an answer. The reason why a child is born in Syria today, where all hell is breaking loose seemingly all the time, is because that child in a previous lifetime, the soul of that child, performed certain negative actions, and it is now time for that karmic residue from those negative actions to be exhausted, to work itself out. And it is partly working itself out through this negative situation that one finds oneself in at birth. So you have, whether it's satisfying or not, at least something of an answer to explain the different situations in which we find ourselves, and to explain why people who do good aren't always rewarded, at least in this given lifetime, and why people who do bad are not always punished, at least as far as we can tell, in this given lifetime. Okay? Now, sometimes in the West, when we think about reincarnation, right, a cycle of death and rebirth, we get kind of really intrigued by it. We get excited by it. We wonder who we might have been in previous lifetimes. And it seems to be kind of this fun, exciting concept. It's important to remember that within many of the Eastern traditions, including Hinduism, samsara is not just this kind of fun, positive, I wonder who I was in another lifetime sort of concept. It actually ends up being kind of the problem, the obstacle that must be overcome. The idea is that we are stuck in this cycle of samsara because our karmic residue keeps us coming back lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, right? The goal is to not just keep coming back lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. The goal is not just to do a bunch of good karma so that our next life is better than this life, although immediately that can be an intermediary goal. The goal ultimately is to escape from this cycle of death and rebirth, because even if we're doing good, life is still difficult and there are still negative things that occur in this life. And the goal is a kind of immortality, a kind of experience in which we will no longer face this cycle of death and rebirth. And that goal in the Upanishads is referred to as moksha, the third of our concepts listed on the screen. Moksha is, this is the way we should always think of moksha, it is the liberation from samsara. We could talk about salvation, that's another word that is used very frequently here, but a liberation, it is that escape from the cycle of death and rebirth, right? We're stuck in that cycle because seemingly we're always performing actions which seem to create karmic residue. That karmic residue isn't always exhausted in a given lifetime, and that necessitates a return for another lifetime where our good and bad karma can be exhausted, can work itself out, right? Hinduism will eventually teach that we're not even just born as human beings on earth. We can be born in different realms, in the heavens and the hells. Those are not eternal places for most of Hinduism. They are temporary locations for particular lifetimes. So if we have accumulated a lot of good karma, we might even go to a heavenly realm where some of that good karma can be exhausted through the experience of rewards and blessings. But eventually we will have to come back to earth in order to still strive for moksha. Traditional Hinduism will often say that it is really only as a human being on earth that we can make significant spiritual progress toward moksha, toward the liberation from samsara, from the cycle of death and rebirth. We can also, in traditional Hinduism, be reborn as non-human aspects of creation. We can be born as non-human animals on earth, for example, to face some of the consequences of, for example, our negative karma. We might be born as a certain type of non-human animal. So this is the experience in which we find ourselves. You can see how this is very different from just focusing on health and happiness in this life by maintaining a certain harmony with the gods and goddesses, right? It's a very immediate kind of focus that you see in the early portions of the Vedas. Here we have turned our attention toward speculation concerning the big questions about individual existence. What is the goal of my existence? What stands in the way of me achieving that goal? These kinds of questions are now being answered with very fundamental ideas that will continue to shape most Hindus to this day in their understanding of their spiritual existence. So karma, that system of rewards and punishments attached to various actions, which then sticks on our soul, causing us to come back again and again in samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, that notion of reincarnation. The goal is to break that cycle to achieve moksha, the liberation from samsara. That will be the goal. What that goal looks like is a bit up in the air. It's just like asking Jews or Christians or Muslims exactly what the experience of heaven will be. Well, certainly there are symbols and suggestions found in sacred texts and through the work of theologians. But most within those three traditions will say that we cannot actually fully understand or grasp what that experience will look like. And moksha is understood in a very similar way by most Hindus. It is clearly a liberation from samsara, but what exactly it ends up looking like, what exactly that experience will be, if there will be something continually experienced, those questions, certainly we have answers suggested by different scholars, but definitely no consensus in terms of answers to those kinds of questions. But still, moksha remains the goal, the liberation from samsara, which we are stuck in because of karma and the residue that sticks on our souls. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit about how the Upanishads understand the method by which we can make spiritual progress and eventually attain moksha.